Saga of the Scout by Cliff Hamrick. Chapter 1. Ethan sat in the back seat of his father's Range Rover as they drove down I-35 from Austin to the Natural Bridge Caverns Wildlife Ranch. He wanted to sit in the front seat with his father. He argued that he would be taking his driving test soon and he needed to watch his father as he drove. But his sister, Emily, got her way. She usually did. She wasn't going to take her driving test soon. She already had her license and even her own car. She was a senior in high school and close to graduation in college. But if she didn't get her way, then she would spend the rest of the day making everyone miserable. She was already irritated that Ethan got to pick the family's activity for the visitation with their father. And Ethan didn't want to make it worse by insisting on riding in the front seat. She had to relent on the day's activity, though. Their father set the rule years ago when they were kids that they would alternate who got to choose what they did during their weekends with him. He was always fair. Ethan always played by the rules. Emily usually pushed things. But today, it was Ethan's day to choose, and he had seen the billboards for the wildlife ranch on the side of the highway for years as they made their trips back and forth between their mother's house in Austin and San Antonio for the weekend visitations with their father, and a bright, warm spring day on the last weekend of spring break seemed like a good day to be outdoors. Emily wanted to go shopping and to a movie, probably a boring romantic comedy that girls liked. Ethan didn't think she really liked those movies, she just knew that he didn't. Later, Ethan would think of how different his life would have been if the events of that day had unfolded while trapped inside a crowded theater rather than visiting the outskirts of town where he could escape easily. He heard Emily and their father talking in the front seat. He didn't pay attention. It had nothing to do with him. She was just talking about gymnastics scholarships that she got from a nearby university. He just looked out the window as the world went by, like he usually did on these hour-long trips. They were in between cities, not quite the country, but not quite the suburbs. Ethan identified the trees in the distance by their size and shape: live oak, mesquite, and a lot of ash juniper. Ethan was a patrol leader in the Boy Scouts with his star rank badge. He loved the outdoors and always had since his father got him started in the Cub Scouts in elementary school. Ethan was grateful that his mother let him continue with scouting even after his parents got divorced. It was the one thing that gave him a real happiness in life. His love of the outdoors even influenced his style of clothing. He usually wore hiking shoes with blue jeans and a t-shirt. Today's shirt had a Captain America shield on it. Because of the cooler mornings that a Texan spring can bring, he also wore a brown hoodie. His short blonde hair was usually unkempt, unlike his sister's bright blonde hair, which was neatly pulled back into a ponytail. When they arrived at the wildlife ranch, Ethan led them on a tour of the various animals in large enclosures around the grounds. They had just arrived at the gibbons enclosure, a large circular pavilion with a cage around it to prevent the gibbons from escaping. The pen had plenty of branches and perches above the ground where the gibbons could swing and climb. As Ethan and his family watched, the gibbons were quite active, swinging obsessively from one side of the pavilion to the other, never stopping or resting. Ethan read an entry about gibbons from the ranch brochure to his family. A gibbon's ability to swing through the trees is called a brachiation. They spend almost all of their lives in the branches of trees where they eat a diet primarily of fruits and leaves. When he looked up, he noticed Emily was glaring at one of the gibbons as it hooted loudly at her. She looked annoyed, but she wore that look most of the time. Ethan's father seemed a bit bored as well. That was strange, as his father usually attempted to encourage Ethan's interests, at least. Fruits and leaves, huh? Emily smirked as she watched the gibbons. Ethan's eyes followed hers as painful shrieks replaced excited hoots. One of the large gibbons grabbed a smaller one and sunk its fangs into its back. The gibbons panicked and leapt away from a vicious attack. Then their panic changed into a mass assault as other gibbons grabbed the nearest one within reach. It didn't matter the size or age of the ape. Young killed old, old killed young, the strong ripped into the weak. Those who weren't caught up in the fight slammed their bodies against the cage in an attempt to escape. The loud clangs of muscle against steel mixed with cries of pain. Ethan stood there in shock. He wasn't bothered by the blood, and there was a lot of it. He had been hunting and fishing many times before, and the sight of blood didn't affect him. What shocked him was the sudden and inexplicable violence in animals that were docile just moments ago. He felt he should do something to help the weaker ones escape, but all he could do was watch helplessly as the blood dripped to the concrete below. Ugh, his father said. Let's go. I'm hungry. Ethan heard boredom in his father's voice and watched as he casually walked away from the screams of the dying primates and the roars of their assailants. Emily sighed and followed their father, her blonde ponytail bobbing behind her. Ethan looked around. Oh, what? He noticed their family scene playing out around the enclosure. Some families seemed to be horrified at what they were watching, while others seemed annoyed and wandered away. A mother wandered away from her crying toddler. A child giggled as she hurled peanuts at the body of a dead gibbon. A young couple kissed passionately and groped each other through their clothes, obviously to the carnage right next to them. Ethan turned and walked quickly to catch up with his father and sister as they walked back to the visitor's center. All around him, Ethan could see the violence from the gibbon's enclosure playing out again and again in the wildlife ranch. To the right, goats rammed their horns repeatedly into each other until one horn snapped off and blood streamed down their faces. Across the parking lot, a male rhino charged through the open field, threatening other animals with its long horn. All around them were scenes of inexplicable carnage, and yet his family seemed not to notice or care about it. They entered the visitor center and walked past the rows of cheap stuffed animals and even cheaper t-shirts with the ranch's logo printed on them. Ethan's father strode up to the counter where snacks were sold. Behind the counter was a college-aged man with his back to them. He stared up at the clock on the wall. Even through the wall of the visitor center, Ethan could hear the screams of innocent animals and the cries of scared animals. Even through the walls of the visitor center, Ethan could hear the screams of innocent animals and the cries of scared people. The sounds became more distinct as the doors of the visitor center were opened repeatedly as more and more people entered. Apparently, his family wasn't the only one that had become suddenly hungry. "Do you have any real food or just this crap?" his father demanded from the man, tossing a bag of potato chips onto the counter. Emily stood behind her father with her arms crossed against her chest and glared at the man. Her face tilted down slightly and her blue eyes flickered over the man's back. Ethan studied her face for a moment. She didn't look like the entitled sister he tried to love despite their differences. She looked like a predator sizing up her prey. He whispered to her, "Emily, are you okay?" She didn't respond. And soon there was a crowd forming around the counter. Some people demanded food, while others were confused and frightened. The angry shouts rose up until they eventually drowned out the sounds of shrieking animals and crying children outside. The father yelled, "I asked you a fucking question. Answer me!" The young man behind the counter finally turned to face the crowd. He had the same look of annoyed boredom Ethan saw on his father's face a moment ago. He said, "We have what we have. What the hell do you want me to do about it?" His indifferent response enraged one of the men standing near Ethan's father, and he leaned over the counter to grab at the young man. He accidentally jostled Ethan's father, which caused his father to go into a rage. "Watch what you're doing, shithead!" The man then turned his attention to Ethan's father and shoved him back into the other people. The momentary tussle caused a cascade of pushing in the crowd. "Dad!" Ethan shouted. He just wanted all of this to stop. A number of people were spurred on by the violence. In an instant, people grabbed and shoved others in the crowd. Ethan and a few others looked on in stunned fear as they saw their loved ones join in the fight. Mothers, fathers, children, and siblings attacked the nearest person to them, though there didn't seem to be any cause. A chubby woman, not much older than Emily, with mousy brown hair and wearing a Dallas Cowboy t-shirt, grabbed Ethan by the shoulders. She shook him hard while shouting into his face, "Do you know how long I've been waiting? I need me time. Me time." Ethan was so confused and frightened by the whole scene that all he could do was look into her red face as he tried to figure out what he did to make her so angry. Behind her, he could see his father scratching and clawing at a pudgy, middle-aged woman. "Dad!" Ethan cried out. "Stop it!" The woman shaking Ethan reared her head back and howled like a crazed animal. Her howl was interrupted by Emily's fist as she punched the woman across the jaw. "Get your fucking hands off my brother!" Emily's tone was imperious. She wasn't concerned for her kid brother. She was insulted that a lesser being would dare touch a member of her family. The chubby woman pushed Ethan away from her, and then turned to attack Emily. She grabbed at Emily's hair and twisted her around. Ethan stumbled back and tripped over a purse, toppling backward and falling onto his butt. The sound of people screaming and cursing, pleading for violence to stop, reverberated off the walls of the small visitor center. Ethan rolled onto his hands and knees and crawled out of the center towards the open door. Others fled the center, clutching purses and small children, trying to save what they could from the rabid crowds of strangers and loved ones. Loud cracks of gunfire, which made Ethan's ears ring, broke over the cacophony of the riot. A gray-haired man had drawn a pistol and fired into the ceiling. The cries rose higher into a full-blown panic, but for the violent ones, the gunshot only seemed to spur them on more. Ethan reached the door and pulled himself to his feet, but was pushed out by a giggling, overweight man carrying an armful of candy bars. Once clear of the door, Ethan looked back to see if his father and sister were following him. People bled and writhed on the floor, either from the gunshots or injuries from the angry mob. Emily straddled the clerk's waist, pinning him to the floor. Her blonde hair hung wildly around her face as she pounded the back of his skull into the tile floor. A thin stream of blood ran in the gout between the tiles as his feet twitched uncontrollably. The man with the pistol fired indiscriminately into the crowd. Ethan saw his father just as a bullet went through the back of his skull and blew his forehead all over the face of the middle-aged woman he was trying to strangle. Ethan turned to run, but was knocked off balance. Not by a panicked victim trying to escape, but a sudden lurch on the earth. The asphalt below him suddenly rose up and fell down, throwing him to his hands and knees. A loud explosion behind him followed the earthquake. Soil and rocks rained down around the parking lot. Car alarms added their noise to the cacophony of screams, shouts, shots, and pleas. Ethan looked behind him at the source of the explosion and saw that a hole large enough to drive a big rig truck through had opened up just a football's field distance away, in the middle of the park across the parking lot. People ran in a blind panic, desperately trying to start their cars and get away. He huddled against the wall and peered around the corner to see what was happening at the pit. Though his animal instincts told him to run away towards safety, if anywhere was safe, his innate curiosity held him in place. Through the sight of people running in a swirling cloud of dust, he could see something moving out of the pit. As the dust settled, he saw the silhouette of a man clamber up to stand on top of a large chunk of asphalt, which had been thrust into the air from the explosion. The man reached behind his back and pulled out an old war horn, just like Ethan had seen in documentaries on Vikings. The man raised the war horn to his lips, tilted his head back, and blew. A loud blast overwhelmed the sound of the chaos, which only began to die down.